You can compute the inverse of a matrix using Gauss-Jordan elimination, but for a 2 by 2 matrix, it turns out there's a method that's often faster. It's easy enough to write down a formula for the inverse of a 2 by 2 matrix, and that's going to be the goal of this video. Now, in order to do that, we're going to need to introduce another idea first. It's called the determinant of a matrix. For the determinant of a 2 by 2 matrix, all you have to do is take the product of the entries on the main diagonal, and so for this matrix it would be A times D, and then the product of the entries off that diagonal, in this case B times C, and subtract. AD minus BC. So, for example, if I have a matrix with entries 2, 3, 1, 2, and I want the determinant, I take the product of the entries on the diagonal, that's 2 times 2, and the product of the entries off the diagonal, that's 3 times 1. 2 times 2 is 4, 3 times 1 is 3, I subtract and get 1. That's the determinant of this matrix. So once you have the determinant, it turns out there's a simple formula for the inverse of a 2 by 2. You start by switching the entries on the diagonal. So notice that if we start with A and D on the diagonal, in the inverse we're going to switch them. So D goes from bottom right to top left, and A goes from top left to bottom right. And then the off-diagonal entries stay where they are, but we change their sign. So instead of B, we have negative B. Instead of C, we have negative C. And we divide the whole thing by the determinant we just learned to compute. So 3 steps. Swap the entries on the main diagonal from top left to bottom right. That's where we switched A and D. Change the sign of the other entries, the ones that are not on the main diagonal, and then divide everything by the determinant of the original matrix. Let's work through an example. Let's find the inverse of 2, 3, 1, 2. So in order to do this, using our formula, the first thing we do is swap the entries and swap the entries on the main diagonal and change the sign of the entries that are off the main diagonal. So since D and A were both 2, it's not obvious here that we've moved them, but you have to imagine we did. We switched the 2 that was in the bottom right corner, move it to the top left. The 2 that was in the top left, move it to the bottom right. And then calculate the determinant. So the determinant is AD minus BC from the original matrix. So that's the product of the entries on the main diagonal, 2 times 2, minus the product of the entries off the diagonal, 3 times 1. So we compute that quantity. 2 times 2 is 4, 3 times 1 is 3, 4 minus 3 is 1. So we're dividing this matrix by the number 1, giving us this matrix again. That's all there is to it. That's a shortcut formula for calculating the inverse of a 2 by 2 matrix.